It had been a busy morning at the New York van ministry, and this had delayed Steve and Lynn from getting to Queens to pick up the food that would be used that day to feed the homeless. The meals would be simple but satisfying. A cup of soup and a sack lunch consisting of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a piece of fruit. Iris and her volunteers had prepared enough that day to feed 250 people. The sandwiches were packed into large bags, and 2 kettles of soup stood by ready for pickup. When the van finally did arrive, volunteers quickly loaded the meals into the back, and after prayer, Steve and Lynn pulled out and headed west to New York City. The driver knew just where to go to find the hungry. Through city traffic, it would take about an hour, but that was all part of the day's job. The van made a couple of stops, and each time their doors were opened, a line would form quickly. People knew the food would be fresh and delicious, and they loved Iris's soup. There was always enough for 1 serving each. The people had learned that they would receive a full cup, but that seconds would not be given. The food must be shared with others as hungry as they were. As the van drove through the busy city streets, people couldn't help but notice the bold words written on the side: Seventh-day Adventist Community Health Services. To those less fortunate in the city, the van provided a welcome meal, as well as the opportunity to pick up some spiritual reading material, including Bibles. While the food would feed their physical bodies, the books would feed those hungry for words that could bring them everlasting life. Since the van had gotten a later start than usual, they agreed that their third stop would be made at a certain large park a bit further away, where they knew they would find many homeless people. This would allow them to finish up quicker without having to make further stops. When the van finally pulled up to the edge of that park, homeless persons saw the vehicle and they began to come from every direction. It was a chilly day, and they looked forward to that soup. Knowing what to do, they simply formed a line, waiting patiently for their turn. Soon, Lynn noticed that they were close to finishing up the first kettle, with only 3 or 4 ladles of soup left. So she asked Steve to lift the second kettle into place, so they could continue serving without interruption. Steve quickly turned to bring out the second kettle, but it wasn't there. After frantically looking in every corner, he turned to Lynn, and with quiet, concerned tones, he said, "We didn't bring the second kettle of soup. It got left back at the warehouse." Now this really was a crisis. The people were hungry. They could stand in line for quite a while patiently, knowing that they were going to eat. But to have waited so long, only to be suddenly told there was no more soup, that would not be a pleasant experience. And there was no time to drive all the way back to Queens for the other kettle, for the vans were not sent out after dark. Lynn thought quickly and decided to give half a cup of soup to each person, hoping to at least stretch out the last few servings they had left. Steve handed the next man in line a sandwich, and Lynn gave him the now half-full cup of soup. The man glanced inside his cup and handed it back to Lynn, saying, "This isn't full." Lynn couldn't refuse him, so she finished filling it up, and handed the now precious soup back to the man. As Lynn looked toward the crowd, she estimated that there were over 100 people in line, and others still coming. Glancing back into the kettle, she saw that there was just a couple of servings left. What would they do now? Lynn and Steve exchanged worried glances, then bowed their heads, pleading for help from God. The next cup was filled full, and the sack lunch was given. And the next, and the next, and the next. From the bottom of that one kettle, a kettle that they well knew held only 125 servings, Lynn continued serving soup. By the time they were done, all 250 sack lunches had been given out, along with 250 full cups of soup. Every person was satisfied. As Steve and Lynn drove home, they were in awe. What had they just witnessed? In the Bible, we read that Jesus fed a group of 5,000 from a young boy's lunch. Can he still do similar miracles today? Yes, he can.